Welcome. You've reached ChristianApologist.com, and it's actually Christian-Apologist.com, and I'm S.J. Thomason, and today I'm delighted to bring you Joel Edmund Anderson, who is a Ph.D. in Biblical Studies. There he is, and he also has a really nice website called Resurrecting Orthodoxy at joeledmundanderson.com. And Joel, would you like to share a little information about yourself? And we're going to chat about his beliefs, and we're going to chat about the historicity of Jesus, biblical inerrancy. We'll talk about people who've been studying these topics, mention some specific people in a little while, and go from there. So, Joel, let us know about yourself.
Well, I'm Joel Anderson. I grew up in Wheaton, Illinois, Wheaton College. My parents went to Wheaton College. So for the most part, I've pretty much grown up in a Christian home. I grew up in evangelicalism, went to a Christian high school, majored in English. My undergraduate is in English literature. I have a teaching degree. Oh, this is weird, right? By the way, I'm very distracted. I'm talking to you on my phone, and underneath is the public link, and it's delayed by a second, so I find myself moving, then underneath it, my hands are moving like 2 seconds later. I'm going to get so distracted. But anyway, so my undergraduate degree is in English. For 16 years, I was a high school English and Bible teacher, a little bit of both. I did that and taught at schools in California for 4 years, Arkansas for 4 years, and in Alabama for 8 years. And now I'm an adjunct professor at the University of North Alabama doing the biblical studies courses. So that's a little bit about my background. I mean, I have graduate degrees in the biblical stuff too. Obviously, they wouldn't let me teach in college if I didn't. So that's a little bit of my personal background in a nutshell.
So let me ask you this. You and I are both from Illinois originally. So we just chatted, just to mention real quick that it's kind of fun, that you are very familiar with the town I'm from, which is Aurora, Illinois, where they filmed Wayne's World.
Yeah.
That's the only claim to fame, I think, of Aurora, Illinois. And you're from Wheaton. So.
When that first came out in like the late 80s, like 1989, Mike Myers, and I remember watching that SNL skit. It was like, I've been there. I've been to Aurora. And here's the weird thing. That was like, when you think about it, that's like over 25 years ago that those skits. So I find myself, when I'm teaching, sometimes I make a reference to it thinking the kids will get it, and they don't get it. So, so if I'm talking about something in the Old Testament, and I'll be like, okay, let's go back to the time of David, diddle-doo, diddle-doo, diddle-doo. And they're like, what are you doing? It's like, come on, Wayne's World. And they have no idea.
Oh, I know. I know. That's the crazy thing. You have to realize many of them were just born in this century. So.
I know. Time is a bizarre concept when you get older. But yeah, like I said, most of my professional career, I taught at the high school level. I kind of wanted to do that after I got my first master's degree at Regent College in the New Testament. I knew a lot of people, a lot of friends who wanted to be professors in college. I always wanted to teach in high school, because when I got to graduate school, when I got to graduate school, learning, biblical studies at the graduate level, the thing that I found myself thinking a lot, it was, why wasn't I taught this in high school? Because I went to a Christian high school, and, quite frankly, a lot of my Bible classes were kind of crappy, Sunday school level simplistic stuff. And so when I got to graduate school and I started learning this stuff, there are obviously some things at the graduate level biblical studies that are really complicated, but a lot of the basic stuff should be taught at the high school level. It's not that difficult to grasp. And so what I always wanted to do was to take what I learned at the graduate level and kind of bring it down to, normal people, who aren't going to get degrees in biblical studies, because it's really needed. Because what happens is you have, graduate level scholars who are way up here, and you have the typical person in the pew who's like way down here, and there's nothing to get you from here to here, Some scholars try to write more popular books, and that's good, but I still think there's a wide gap between your typical person in the pew and biblical studies. And so anyway, so I wanted to teach high school and kind of fill that gap. And I did that for 16 years, but then there were a few complications that happened that got me out of high school, and now I'm teaching college. We can talk about that maybe later when we talk about some other stuff. But it's kind of a fascinating thing. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So, and I was just noticing there's a few people who are in the audience asking questions like, why did you have Bible class in high school? But you mentioned that it's a Christian high school, correct? Yeah.
Right.
So that's a good thing. Now, I think that what we should maybe chat about first is we'll talk a little bit about the views that some people have towards the Bible and towards the book of Genesis and the way that you interpret the book of Genesis. And you mentioned different genres in Genesis. And in your blog, you've written some really nice things on that. So, and actually, it helped me to learn a bit reading your blog. Your blogs are very, very good. So would you like to chat about that?
Specifically about Genesis?
Yeah, about Genesis and young Earth creationism and the idea that from young Earth creationism that the world is 6,000 years old.
Well, okay, I'll get to that in a second. But first, the blog itself, let me just say something about the blog itself. The blog itself is, I started a couple of years ago when I was still teaching in high school, teaching biblical worldview. When I taught biblical worldview, I did an Old Testament course for freshmen. Sophomores got New Testament. Juniors was like church history stuff, and then senior level was more, looking at different philosophies and stuff. So I was kind of learning that stuff on my own. Stop it! I have a dog who's whining, and so when I started the blog, the purpose of the blog was just I wanted to I think better when I write, and so I wanted to just make a blog where I could put out things about a variety of things. If you check out my blog, I have some posts on specifically biblical studies, Genesis stuff. I have a number of series where I kind of just go through kind of a detailed book analysis of various books. One of the first things I did was I went through Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I read that in high school and it was life-changing. So you read a number of those posts that kind of take you through C.S. Lewis, and just a variety of other books. On whether it's New Atheism or the Young Earth Creationist debate or just basic biblical study stuff. I have a number of things on there. And actually right now I'm kind of doing two series I'm on my phone and somebody texted me. So I didn't give anybody the finger there. Right now I'm kind of in the midst of on my blog. One of the series I'm doing is I'm going through Josephus's Wars of the Jews and his telling of the Jewish War of 70 AD. It's really hard to read. It's really tough sledding. And so one of the things I'm doing just, selfishly for myself is as I'm reading through it, every couple chapters, I'm just kind of writing my own synopsis, making it kind of more of a Reader's Digest friendly version. And so I'm kind of doing that series. And then I'm also doing, I'm currently going through Bart Ehrman's How Jesus Became God book. I'm kind of picking that apart. So that's kind of what I do on my blog. It's kind of a variety of things that interest me.
I think they interest a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, there's a wide variety of stuff. There's biblical study stuff, book review stuff. Last year I even did like a huge series, like 60 posts on what I called the War of the Worldviews, which is basically a book I was putting together for my high school students. But then I stopped teaching high school, so I had all this material. So I thought I'd just put up and post. And basically, it kind of gives an overview of Western civilization and the various things. So I do a lot of variety of things. So yeah, that's the blog. As far as the young Earth creationism stuff goes, I should probably give a little bit of background of how I got into that. Hold on, my dog is whining. I'm going to be off camera for a second.
Oh, no worries.
I'm going to let him out. Okay, buzz. There you go.
Dogs take priority. That's how it should be.
Yeah, because nothing is more distracting trying to talk about young Earth creationism when your dog is whining at the door. Growing up, I'm not a science person. I don't care. I'd never liked science. I was always literature and history and biblical stuff, even as a kid. And so when it came to the whole creation evolution debate, I never cared about it, you know. But when I was in graduate school, one of the things I would study, obviously, is biblical studies and studying the proper way to understand Genesis, and specifically Genesis 1 through 3. As I studied it, I became more and more convinced that Genesis 1 through 11, isn't intending to give historical stuff. Okay, I believe, for the most, lack of better way to say it, the history part of the Bible starts with Abraham, and the first 11 chapters kind of give the big worldview backdrop from which you interpret history. We'll get into that later. I just saw somebody said, "Man, I love science." Sorry, I've learned to appreciate science more, Jen, but I'm getting better at it. But growing up, it's just not my natural thing. But anyway, what I was going to say though is, when I was in graduate school, I studied, did research and stuff on the early chapters of Genesis, and I just, obviously it's not history, and I say that because at that time, I never looked into the creation evolution debate at that time. And that's important because a lot of the things you get from young Earth creationists like Ken Ham, they often say the only reason people don't read the early chapters of Genesis as history is because they want to, inject evolution in millions of years. Well, I'm living proof that I came to the conclusion about the early chapters of Genesis long before I even cared about evolution or anything. So, my understanding came on good biblical studies, what it is. And so anyway, in my course of my high school teaching, occasionally when I would cover Genesis, I didn't get into that debate, really. I just said, this is how you see, this is what Genesis is teaching, but I didn't really even get into the debate with my students because of the controversial issue and whatnot.
Well, let me ask you this, because you can see Deconverted Man here in the audience is asking about Adam and Eve. What's your take on, and actually I haven't really made a very concrete decision on what my views are on Adam and Eve, whether or not that's to be taken literally or if it's to be taken more figuratively. So what is your take?
Okay, in a nutshell, the Hebrew word that we had, Adam, means mankind. And I don't think there was a historical Adam and Eve, and I don't think the story is intending to say that. I'll just throw this out there, the word that freaks people out, but I'll explain it. I believe that Genesis 1 through 11 is mythological literature, but unfortunately, when you say that, people misunderstand what that means, and they think you're just denigrating it and saying it's not true. When I say that, it's talking about a genre. In the ancient world, the way they discussed their beliefs about the gods and about the purpose of humanity and all that stuff, they didn't write in history. They used this genre that we now label as myth, but whatever you call it, they weren't doing history with it. And so basically, Adam and Eve, I think, is the story of humanity. In other words, we are Adam and Eve. Humanity is Adam and Eve. And the story isn't trying to tell us where sin came from at one point in history. It's, this is who you are. You're made in God's image, but you sin. And so the Adam and Eve story is humanity. And it's setting out, and those early chapters are setting out the Israelite understanding of humanity. Humanity is made in God's image to care for his creation, but every single one of us sins and we screw it up, and therefore, we need salvation. So what somebody wrote, there's no actual historical Adam and Eve. I'm like, yeah, there isn't a historical Adam and Eve, I don't think. I think the story is meant to be about humanity. And so yeah. Actually, in a couple of weeks in May, on another Facebook site called I think it's called Preterist Smackdown, I'm taking part in a debate specifically on Noah's flood, and that kind of fits in to the whole how do you interpret Genesis 1 through 11 stuff.
Well, that's my next question. What's your interpretation of Noah's flood?
We're jumping into all the fun stuff. Basically, again, I don't think anything in 1 through 11 is meant to, Genesis 1 through 11 is meant to be actual history. I think the Noah's flood is taken from other ancient Near Eastern flood stories like Gilgamesh and Atrahasis. I can mispronounce the name. Other flood stories. Simply put, in the ancient Near East, those flood stories, again, were really trying to say something to reflect what the people of that time believed about the gods. And for example, in one of the stories, people are worthless, okay? And in some of the pagan stories, the gods send the flood because the people are just being too loud and the gods can't get some sleep, so let's just kill them all, okay? So if you're a pagan and you're reading one of those stories, what you are being taught is, I'm worthless, the gods are crazy. There's no rhyme or reason. Whereas then you get the Noah story, which, take the Noah story, compare it to the Epic of Gilgamesh. The similarities are there. The basic storyline and plot is the same. But what you look for are the differences. And that's where the distinctive Israelite worldview comes in. In the Genesis story, in the flood story, the reason for the flood isn't because human beings are just too sleepy or too loud and God can't get some sleep. It's because you're told right before that odd story about the sons of God going into the daughters of man and giving birth to the Nephilim, that weird story that nobody knows what to make of. That's a whole nother issue. But basically, that story is trying to articulate the corruption of humanity. The reason for the flood in the Noah story is because human beings are sinful and are destroying God's creation and deserve judgment. Now, again, you can get into other issues, but the point is the Israelite story is trying to say the flood happens because human beings are sinful and deserve judgment, whereas the other ones are they're worthless. Again, you look at that story and you're trying to understand what what's the theology being taught. And then in addition, I'll argue in that debate that the Noah story is really a decreation, recreation story. When God sends the floodwaters to cover the earth, he's basically taking things back to the way they were in Genesis 1:1. Then he recreates. And so then the story you get of Noah in chapter 9, when he makes his covenant with Noah is portrayed as like Adam 2.0, God starting over. But then what you see happens is what transpires from there in the next few chapters follows a pattern in the first few chapters. Actually, I'm going to cover that in that debate. I'm going to kind of show a chart and stuff. It's a tight literary unit, and it's really, really kind of interesting.
It is interesting, actually. I like hearing your views. Do you? Craig is also on here. He wants to know if you get any blowback from other Christians on your views, because obviously there is a contingent who would not agree with you.
Okay, who said that?
Craig Reed. He's the one who's Christian Response.
Oh, okay.
On the feed.
Well, that question would actually lead well into a little biographical story of why I ended up teaching in college. At my previous school, when I was hired there at the school in Alabama, the headmaster hired me there. He knew me from Arkansas. He had moved over and he hired me. And he wanted me to start the worldview program. And so I kind of constructed it from 9th to 12th grade. And about my second year there in the senior class, we already had a unit on Marx and a unit on Freud and analyzing them. And this is like probably 2009. I thought, hey, I should probably have a unit on Darwin because he really is influential and we should understand what it is. Now, here's the thing. In 2009, if you would have asked me if I had believed in evolution was true at all, I would have said no. But I never looked into it. I just, I didn't care. But if you would have asked me if I thought the world was 6,000 years old, I would have said, obviously not. It was just one of those topics I never really looked into. So I thought what I would do, I'd have a Darwin unit so my seniors could look into this and kind of find out how stupid Darwin is. But then when I researched it more and I understood the issues more, I realized a lot of Christians who object to evolution, they really object to it because they think that Genesis 1 through 11 is history. Okay, and so it's like it's based on a misunderstanding of Genesis 1 through 11. So evolution can't be true, you know. But I already knew that Genesis 1 through 11 wasn't meant to be history, so I was able to just look at the scientific evidence in and of itself and not be biased by a faulty interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11. So that being said, for a number of years I would have that unit, and that's the only time I touched upon the topic with my students at this Christian school. And for the most part, it was great. The students were really engaged, and they really wanted to learn about it. You know, some difference of opinion, but that's okay. That's what you do in worldview class. You get this out and you get them to talk about it. So for the first few years, it was fine. Then that headmaster moved on to another place, and they hired another guy, and he ended up being like a hardcore, zealous young Earth creationist. And he didn't like the fact that I didn't believe Ken Ham. And that's a whole long story. But long story short is, after a year or two, after his first 2 years, when that Ken Ham Bill Nye debate came about, and at that point, that was 2014, I still didn't know a whole lot about evolution, but I knew a little bit about Ken Ham, but I wanted to watch the debate and see what happens. Well, I watched the debate, and on my old blog that I had back then, I wrote a number of posts analyzing the debate and basically not agreeing with Ken Ham. And the headmaster, the new young Earth creationist headmaster, got a hold of my post, and basically he used that as an excuse to basically fire me.
Wow.
When the end of that school year, I'd already signed the contract for the next year, but over the summer he brought me in and he basically said, well, I mean, it was a long thing. I'm really simplifying it, but basically he said, we don't think you're a good fit for the worldview program anymore. That's the worldview program that I built. And it was really because I was not a young Earth creationist. He thought, and if you know young Earth creationist stuff, I was a wolf in sheep's clothing. I spoke with the voice of the serpent. I was a compromised Christian. And so I was there for one more year because I had signed the contract. But after that, he kind of let me go. And fortunately, the local university had an adjunct position where I'm now getting into teaching biblical studies at the biblical level. So that story, whoever asked that question, do I get blowback from other Christians? Yeah, I lost my job over it.
Wow. That's kind of similar to what I just read about with Mike Licona and his interpretation of Matthew in the, I think it's Matthew 27 right around verse 53 or so.
Yeah, the story went when Jesus dies on the cross, the dead came into the city and stuff. And the thing is, but thing I've learned about that is, yes, there are some what I would call more really fundy right-wing, ultra right-wing conservative Christians who freak out over this, and you do lose your jobs over that. And a lot of people have, actually. When that happened to me, and then I got started at the college. When I started this blog that I have now, I think it was in July or August of 2016, 15. You could probably find it. I wrote a post why I am not teaching this year, and I had a lot of former students, and it blew up. I mean, it got a lot of hits. You could probably find it on my blog. So it was that was a tough thing to do because whether or not one believes the Earth is young or not, there's difference of opinion, and I think somebody's wrong. But what concerns me over young Earth creationism is that they make that like a fundamental tenet of the faith. Like they actually say, if you don't believe the Earth is 6,000 years, that's the foundation for the gospel. Well, you look at church history. No, it's not.
I've been in arguments with people about that. And it actually, I've got to the point where I just got really frustrated because I thought that is not the reason why I even read the Bible. Jesus Christ is the reason. His resurrection is what it's all about.
And it's about properly interpreting the Bible and understanding what it says. I lost that job, and I started the blog, and I have a lot of posts on young Earth creationism from those first 2 years because I was just trying to figure out, because at the time I didn't understand, how could you fire me for that? And then I started reading more Ken Ham stuff, and I was I was legitimately shocked at some of the ludicrous things he claims. I've been to the Ark Encounter, that he built when it first
Oh, you
opened.
have?
Yes,
What's that like?
It's a trip. I mean, I can't even begin. I guess I probably will begin. Some of the things he claims, like that aren't in the Bible, and this is the ironic thing about it. In order to argue that the flood was historical, you go into the Ark. Everything he has up there is fiction to support his claim that it wasn't fiction. Noah went to shipwright school. Like, where in the Bible does it say that? Noah had and this is the funniest one. I still make fun of this. No, the pre-flood civilization probably had advanced technology that Noah was able to use to build the ark. And he says at one point in one of his posts, he had access to advanced technology that probably far surpassed the technology we have today. Okay, think about that. Did he just claim that, like, Noah had access to a flux capacitor and computers and lasers? It's so weird. And he bases that claim on like one verse in Genesis 4 where it said one of the descendants of Cain were experts in iron and bronze. Like, you're getting that to advanced, it's just bizarre. He has a diorama at the Ark Encounter of the pre-flood civilization of like some giant in a Roman Colosseum, looks like a Roman Colosseum, and these innocent people are being thrown to the velociraptors.
Oh, no. He does not have that.
Because his big thing is there must have been dinosaurs on the Ark, and his whole big thing is lived with dinosaurs. And it's just so silly. And the scary thing is he's convinced a lot of people that if dinosaurs didn't live with humans 4,000 years ago, then you can't trust that Jesus rose from the dead. And people believe that.
Oh, my gosh. See, that's doing us a horrible disservice.
Yeah. On one hand, you look at it and it's hilarious because it's so silly. But then you find out that some people really have bought into this. That's kind of scary. So it's funny and scary at the same time. But anyway, because of that, there's one more thing. I just realized this. I ended up writing a book about it. Woohoo! Heresy.
Wow.
Yeah, and it was basically what every evangelical needs to know about the creation evolution controversy.
That's great.
And it's not just a whole book of ham bashing. It starts out with properly understanding what heresy is. There's a little church history in it, a little kind of mini commentary on Genesis 1 through 11. And once I set up what actual biblical exegesis is and what Genesis 1 through 11 is actually saying, then the second half of the book, I kind of say, let's look at what Ken Ham says. And I go through a bunch of his blog posts and a whole bunch of stuff. It was kind of fun to write. And the funny thing is,
that's great. I think that's great. Joel, where can we find that book? Is that on Amazon or where is it selling?
Amazon.com, Heresy of Ham. You could find it. The funny thing is one of my students from that high school, she's now in college. A couple of years ago, she got my book and stuff. She and some family members went to the Ark Encounter, and she sent me this picture, and I have it on my mantelpiece. It's the picture of my book in front of the Ark Encounter.
It's awesome.
So that was kind of funny. That was kind of a funny thing to do. But anyway, so young Earth creationism, I kind of have a problem with, obviously, but it's an important. It's a problem. I think that I think people need to be aware of what the arguments are and stuff. So
I think so too, and I think it's sort of a fine line though for us as Christians, because we don't want to disenfranchise those people either. So we want to somehow keep them on board and listening, but yet we don't want. So you have to be very careful in how you talk about it.
Oh yeah, I mean that. And anybody who's been on a Facebook page on a controversial issue knows how easy it is just to get into insulting comments back and forth. And that's the the trick with anything, whether it's, Republicans, Democrats talking, or this issue, how to make your case, say, hey, I think you're wrong, but not be so insulting that they just want to flip you off,
Exactly.
Some people are going to flip you off no matter what, but it's just one of those things that it's difficult. And when you get into conversation, sometimes things do get a little testy. I like to think I haven't ever said anything that horrible, but every now and then you put in a few zingers because somebody's irritating you. You look back, it's kind of fun.
Yeah, I've been known to do that. Unfortunately, I just did it a couple days ago. I sent out a tweet. And I thought, oh, that was the worst tweet ever. Why did I send that? So I deleted it. But of course, someone screenshotted it and is now retweeting it.
Yeah, and it happened. Well, that's human life. I mean, when you're searching for truth, you wrestle with things, and so you're not perfect. Which again is one of the points of Genesis 3. Human beings aren't perfect. You do screw up. When you reach out for wisdom, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you're not prepared for it. And we are all immature and naive to an extent. And it's that process, where we become, more mature. And in fact, getting back to the Adam and Eve thing, one of the things that really convinced me of the view that I came to have is reading a lot of church history. One of the early church fathers, Irenaeus, who was like 2nd century, he was basically a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. So he goes way back. And in his book Against Heresies, he talks about the Gnostic view of Adam and Eve and creation, and how they claimed that Adam and Eve were like these superhuman people, and he gets into what he claims is the early church view of Adam and Eve, and he basically says Adam and Eve weren't perfect. Only God is perfect. That's the point. Adam and Eve are made in God's image, but they're naive and young. That's the whole idea of that they're naked. They're childlike, and so they're reaching out for the tree of knowledge of good and evil is inevitable because we're humans. We're not perfect, but God knows that, and He works through that to bring us to a truer salvation. And it's through that reaching out and failing that we come to have a true knowledge of good and evil experientially, and then we are able to then become more like God as we surrender to Him. It's a fascinating thing. I actually have I think a 6-part series somewhere on my blog where I talk about Irenaeus, where it kind of explains all of it, and it's.
I'm excited. I'm going to come over to your blog and I'm going to get your book and all that good stuff. So thank you. You're a wealth of knowledge, and that's refreshing to have such a knowledgeable viewpoint on the Bible. So let me ask you this. Speaking of knowledgeable viewpoints on the Bible, what's your take on the historicity of Jesus? And I know that you and I have been in back and forth debates with people like Richard Carrier, and he thinks that Jesus is a myth, and Aaron Ra, he also shares that view of Jesus is a myth, and so you've obviously done a lot of detailed work in the New Testament. What do you think?
That's one of those things that isn't even an issue with 99% of scholars, and that's one of when that whole Twitter battle happened last week. If somebody's an atheist and doesn't believe Jesus is divine or God, okay. I mean, let's face it. When you're reading some things in the Gospels, on their face, some of them are kind of hard to swallow, obviously, those claims. So if somebody doesn't believe that he's divine in any way, okay, that's fine. That I understand why people would doubt that. But when you get to the point where you don't believe there wasn't even a historical Jesus, I'm sorry, but to me, that's just as loony as Ken Ham claiming that Adam and Eve had a pet dinosaur. It's not even an issue with 99% of scholars. And again, and if you remember the Twitter battle, I admit I have not read Carrier's 700+ page work.
No, I haven't either.
I watched a number of his lectures. To see, because normally you go to a lecture to see, hey, is this guy convincing enough to make me want to buy the book? And just quite frankly, just the arguments he gives they're not good arguments. He butchers the biblical text. Some of the things he claims about what certain passages are saying, no biblical scholar in their right mind reads it that way. And it's not because they're afraid. It's because it's not true. So yeah, it just wasn't convincing. And at some point, I think I'm probably going to try to maybe sometime soon take a break from my writing about the Bart Ehrman book and maybe write a couple posts on analyzing those lectures I saw of Richard Carrier. But it's just not. Yeah, it's. I'm trying to think of a good example to show it, but it's silly.
Well, he reinterprets things. Like I read a quote that Tacitus wrote, and he actually reinterpreted Tacitus's quote to mean something it didn't. And so I've written a blog on that too. So
yeah, I mean, he goes so far out of his way to well, I'll give you one example. That one of his basis is, Christianity started because there were some I might be wrong. I think I'm right though. That there were some Hellenistic Jews who basically took pagan myths and said, hey, let's make it into a figure of history because we don't like the temple. He claims that there was a view among Jews at that point that they believed in an archangel named Jesus. Here, look at this passage in Philo. Well, I looked at that passage in Philo. He doesn't mention Jesus. I mean, it's just not there. There's nothing to debate. He doesn't mention an archangel named Jesus. But then he'll go, oh, but that's because that's kind of like this passage in Zechariah, and he quotes passage from Zechariah 3 and Zechariah 6, where it's talking about the high priest Joshua and Zerubbabel rebuilding the second temple. See, let's take that over here and take Philo, where he's talking about the logos, which is a Greek concept of reason, and let's put those together, and we'll make Joshua sound like Jesus. And, he's talking about an archangel named Jesus. Well, no, nobody reads it that way. Making that kind of connection is like Ken Ham, saying that Noah had access to power tools.
Or people were interacting with dinosaurs.
Yeah, it's just factually, nobody reads it that way. The Zechariah part, the Joshua in Zechariah 3 and 6 was an actual person who came out of the exile with the exiles. His name was Joshua. He was a priest. And they were about to rebuild the temple after the exile. That has nothing to do with this idea of an archangel Jesus. That's non-existent. And so how can you debate that? Just point out that you say Philo talks about an archangel Jesus. No, he doesn't. It's just not there. And then also in a lot of his lectures, he just makes some comments that, for lack of a better term, is just juvenile. When he talks about the resurrection account, the angel comes down and opens the tomb. The Bible says that a space monster from outer space came down with a death ray. I'm like, well, no, it doesn't. Nobody thinks that. Or he talks about the beloved disciple who rests upon Jesus' bosom, or on his side. Oh, they're cuddling. Jesus has a boyfriend. I know. And
he actually said that?
Oh yeah, and I know some Christians will get offended by that, and I think that's what he's trying to do. I read that, I'm just like, that's not what it says. If you believe that, then you're not thinking clearly. But I think he says that intentionally just to kind of rile people up because his argument is kind of flimsy. I'm trying to think of another example he gave that I noted some of them, and they're just silly. They're not serious.
Let me talk about, because just to mention also with this idea of historicity, and I see Jen with one end. She's been asking about other historical people who are secular scholars and what their views might have been. And I can just point out that I have a book, for example, by a Dr. Jeffrey Wawro, W-A-W-R-O, from 2008 called, it's basically an historical atlas, and it's called an historical atlas, and it includes 40 different scholars from all around the world who are historians, and it includes the whole story of the early Christianity movement. And so those are just one example. And of course, I know you could speak very well to Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman.
Ehrman, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the only difference between Ehrman and Carrier is Ehrman says, yeah, there really was a historical Jesus, but then after he died, his disciples said he was exalted into heaven like an angel. Whereas Carrier just says, no, there never was a historical Jesus. They said he was an angel. Again, but their basic arguments are the same. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read these comments. I'm sorry, but So yeah, Ehrman, I mean, he's a legitimate biblical scholar, and like when I'm reading his book, a lot of the information he gives is true. You know, how biblical scholars evaluate texts and certain things in Second Temple Judaism. So a lot of it is true. And when I'm writing my post, you know, I say he's right here, but then he makes this conclusion that doesn't fit, and I think he goes off. And
like a non sequitur.
Yeah. Well, what I've noticed with Ehrman is, if you know his background, you know, when he was in high school and college, he became a Christian. He was like a really fundy Christian. He actually writes in his book that when he was in college, he considered Billy Graham too liberal. So that should tell you something. All right. So he's really far right. And I think what happened, not analyze him or anything, but I think what happens is when he walked away from the faith, if you want to say, he realized a lot of those fundamentalist tenets were wrong, but he still tends to come to the text with that wooden literalistic mindset. You know what I mean? And so he still hasn't fully he's not a fundamentalist now, he's an agnostic, but he still tends to read the text in kind of a fundamentalist way. And so I think that's the problem with him. So I'm trying to look at this.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you on that as far as Bart Ehrman. Just going back, I'm going to take a quick tangent here because I also wanted to mention that you said that Mere Christianity was very life-altering for you when you were in high school. And I just discovered that book probably about 6 years ago when a pastor on a plane recommended it to me. So would you like to speak a little bit about what your take on C.S. Lewis is and Mere Christianity?
I will tell you a story of why I got into it. And this is in high school. And this is actually kind of interesting. When I was a junior in high school, I got into a car accident. Kind of, you know, when you're a junior in high school and you get into a big car accident, it kind of evaluates your life. And basically, and I write about this on my blog somewhere. My second half of my junior year in our doctrine class, I kind of got on this little kick, which I was a little Christian militant for a few months. You know, where we got to fight the culture war. And I wrote this paper for my doctrine class about how we're all lukewarm Christians. We have to get out there, you know, kind of moral majority, Jerry Falwell type stuff. Then at the end, and my Bible teacher was so impressed that she had me read my paper in chapel.
Wow.
You know, so I thought going into my senior year, I was going to become this great Christian leader at my school. And the way I could put it is like right when the school year ended, and I'm speaking metaphorically here, but in a way, it's kind of like God tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You don't know what the crap you're talking about." and I kind of went through a crisis of faith that summer. And it just so happened that I was my sister, who was a few years older than me, she was kind of reading some C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, and she had this tape by Sting, Dream of the Blue Turtles, his first solo album. And she got me onto Sting and C.S. Lewis, and Dream of the Blue Turtles and Mere Christianity were like life-altering things for me that summer. And so
That's an interesting combination, Sting and C.S. Lewis.
Sting is awesome. And so basically that summer, I didn't tell anybody this, but I thought, okay, I'm going to rethink whether or not I'm even a Christian, because I've just been parroting the things I've learned all my life. Do I really know this stuff? And so that summer, I kind of considered myself an agnostic, and I kind of read through Mere Christianity, and I said, okay, is what he says convincing? Does it make sense? Is there enough there to go, okay, there's enough there to consider further and stuff. And so basically I read Mere Christianity that summer, and by the end of the summer I was like, okay, yeah, I think there's enough to historic traditional Christianity. It has some meat to it. And so, you know, in some ways I've been Christian all my life, but in other ways that was the summer that I really kind of made it my own. Yeah, the C.S. Lewis Mere Christianity book is phenomenal. Now, again, I don't agree with every single thing in it, but he gives a good explanation about the fundamental basis of Christianity and what it really is about. And I know a lot of evangelical Christians like, oh, I love C.S. Lewis, you know, Narnia, yay, you know, all that stuff. If a lot of more, how can I put this? A lot of evangelicals, if they read C.S. Lewis, they'd be shocked by some of the things he says. I mean, he says in Mere Christianity that, of course, evolution happened, and I mean, he says a lot of stuff that I think your typical fundamentalist evangelical would kind of go, "Oh my gosh, he said that." But he's phenomenal. And then the older I got, I eventually got to Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy. I'm officially Eastern Orthodox, but it happens where I live right now, there's no Eastern Orthodox church, so I go to a Methodist church. But the more I got into Orthodoxy, and then I'd go back and read Mere Christianity, he's really Orthodox. I mean, that book really lays out a lot of basic traditional Christian Orthodoxy from the very beginning. It's just fabulous.
That's interesting, because one of the things that I've always complimented him on is the fact that he's able to kind of unite all of these different faiths. In his writing, he doesn't, he might say something about evolution, but the way he does it, you could have Catholics, you could have people of different Protestant faiths, all kind of standing behind him. He does a really amazing job with that.
Yeah, and that's the name, Mere Christianity. He doesn't want to argue for a denomination. He's like, these are the basic viewpoints that Christianity has always had, and this is how I see them working out. And he does a fabulous job.
How do you, Joel, to piggyback off that idea, how do you, because one of the arguments that I receive from people who are non-believers a lot of times on social media is they'll say, well, how did you pick your particular sect? There are 3,000 different gods, or there are all these different Christian sects, and how did you actually choose yours? Right. So what would you say, or what do you say when I'm sure you've encountered that as well?
Okay, I'll get that. And I just saw a deconverted man ask a question about original sin. I will try to address that. If it's okay, right?
Yeah, sure.
My phone is now at 32%, so obviously this interview is taking a lot of juice from my phone. But to your question, I grew up in Assemblies of God church, charismatic stuff. And even though it was a good church, I'll be honest, I never felt like a charismatic-y person. I just, when they would be speaking in tongues and raising their hands, I was just more reserved. I'm not that way. So I grew up in Assemblies of God church. My senior year after the Mere Christianity revelation, I ended up being disenfranchised. I didn't like my church anymore for various reasons. And so I ended up going to a non-denominational church for a while. Then the thing that started to change was that I was in graduate school at Regent College in Vancouver. There was an Anglican church downtown that was actually really, really uber liberal, apparently. I didn't go to that, but every Sunday night they had this comp line service. I don't know if you know what a comp line service is.
No.
It's basically, it was a half-hour service where the church was basically dark with candles. It was very liturgical. The choir would come in, sit in the choir loft, and they would sing the liturgy and the psalms. And the interesting thing is that a number of my friends were like, "Oh, this comp line service is really cool. You should go." And for a while, I'm like, I don't want to go to that. It sounds Catholic. That was my mentality. And so finally, halfway through my second year there, I thought, okay, I'll go to this comp line service. And we went downtown. It was this old church. It looks, old. And we got there a few minutes late, right when it was starting. And it was just, I can't begin to explain what the experience was. I walked in, and you smelled the incense and the frankincense and the candles and the choir. It was silent. It was reverent. And then just listening to the liturgy, I still remember vividly. Now, I grew up in church all my life. I remember going to that, and my first thought was, this is the first worship service I've ever been in. I literally thought that. And so it got me really interested in liturgy. And then I started reading more Catholic writers like Thomas Merton, and then I eventually got to some Orthodox writers. And over the next few years, I just read more and more Orthodox stuff and found myself thinking, yeah, that's what I've always thought. That's kind of what C.S. Lewis says, about a number of things. And then when I moved to Arkansas, there was an Orthodox church there. So I thought, hey, I'm going to check out an Orthodox church. And this was back in 2003. And I remember going into the Orthodox Church and seeing the icons and the incense and experiencing the liturgy. Another thing occurred to me, I felt I finally found my home. I literally felt like this was home. And so within a few years, I became Orthodox. And then through circumstances, I ended up moving to a place without an Orthodox church.
No, you know what I think, Joel? I think that's one of the answers that we can give people when they say, why do we have certain sects? And, there's all these different choices. Which one is correct? I think we need to finish that sentence as which one is correct for you. Because in your particular case, you grew up in one different group and you ended up gravitating towards another one looking for orthodoxy. In my case, I actually grew up in Catholic churches and I went to Catholic grade school and I ended up gravitating towards Baptist stuff. And I had that same feeling you did when I walked into the Baptist church. And that's just what I needed. It was exactly what I needed.
Yeah, and I think that's the case with a lot of people, and that's fine as long as you realize, to use C.S. Lewis's analogy, you're in the same house. You might be in different rooms, but it's the same house.
Yeah, I like that analogy. I was just thinking, just to go to your phone and the fact that you said you got 32%, I think you might have the vibrate on, because that might be, maybe if it were silent or something, because I think every so often we've been hearing that, so I don't know if.
Oh, I never thought about that. Well, we'll try that.
That might be using up your juice.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the funny thing is, I never really used my Twitter that much, to go on long conversations. And so normally my data usage for my Verizon thing is only 5 gigabytes a month, and I never use it. I maybe get 1.5 used. After that Twitter battle last week with Richard Carrier, it used all my data up. I'm like, I'm out for the next 2 weeks. I have to spend extra $15 to get more. But
I actually had to get unlimited data with Verizon just because I'm on it so much.
Yeah, I might have to end up doing that. Hold on. I don't know. Deconvert Man asked about original sin somewhere. Is the idea of original sin, would that be invalid? Well, here's the thing, and this is one of the things that Ken Ham gets upset about, is just because I don't think Adam and Eve were historical people, it doesn't negate the fact that we're all sinful. I think the doctrine of original sin kind of was really cemented by St. Augustine, and that's a whole nother story of how we got that. And most people think original sin means, oh, we're all sinful. Well, we are all sinful. That's what it's teaching. But the actual doctrine of original sin, and this is kind of a fun story to tell, is back in the 3rd and 4th century, the general view, a lot among that time period, kind of influenced by Stoicism, and basically, let me just check something. Yeah, basically, some Christian philosophers at that point were saying that that before the fall, that human beings, Adam and Eve, wouldn't even have sex because they were very anti-material world kind of thing, and that sex was a consequence of sin. Okay, and Augustine was actually quite liberal for his day, and he basically said, no. Adam and Eve could have had sex before the fall, but what happens is because of sin, sex became infused with lust and desire. Okay, I don't agree with Augustine here. And so he basically said that original sin for Augustine meant that, how can I put this? The sign of original sin was, how can we put it? When a guy gets excited, something happens to a part of his body. And Augustine says that is the sign of original sin, because you're giving into your lust and your desires and your body can't help it. And so basically Augustine said that original sin meant that because when your parents way back when had sex and conceived you, that they were literally engaging in a sinful act because it was filled with desire. Okay? That makes sense?
Yeah, I don't buy that. That's interesting. That's an interesting viewpoint.
But therefore, because of that, you are literally conceived in sin. That's how we get that. And so original sin, if you understand it from the Augustinian perspective, is kind of like making sin the ultimate STD. It's a sexually transmitted disease, which is kind of ridiculous. But so the actual doctrine of original sin basically says you're sinful because your parents enjoyed themselves when you were conceived, which obviously I don't believe. But the early church version in the Orthodox view is really just what they call ancestral sin, which is basically a way of saying the Bible teaches that everybody's sinful. And the whole story of Adam and Eve isn't to tell you where sin came from, but hey, you're Adam and Eve, you're made in God's image and you're sinful. And so, so to his question, the idea of original sin would be invalid. Well, kind of, yeah, because that's the view Augustine had. But that doesn't mean that Genesis 3 denying people are sinful. And obviously that's the point. Genesis 3 isn't trying to tell us where it came from, but just the fact that we're sinful. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. And I think I had met a few Mormon people not too long ago, and they were sharing a little bit about their beliefs in Genesis. And I think they might coincide with what Augustine said in a way.
Yeah.
But I can't speak to that too much because it's not, I'm not a Mormon. I don't completely understand it. Although I might be going to Utah again this summer, so I'll get to encounter a lot of them.
It'll be interesting. So wait, so deep converted man says, well, if sex is a consequence of sin, then yay for sin. Well, that's the point. Deep converted man, sex isn't the consequence of sin. Most people don't even know what the doctrine of original sin means. They just think, oh, the doctrine of original sin means we're all sinful and Adam and Eve is sinful. Well, yeah, but that's not what the doctrine says.
That's interesting.
Rambling. But
so I want to say Jen with one N is on here too, mentioning she's had some. Jen with one N was raised in the church and was a very devout Christian for a very long time, and she's been on my show before. And what happened to her was a couple of things. She was sort of ostracized in the church when she got pregnant by her pastor, and also her pastor. And I don't recall, Jen, exactly what your pastor said about your daughter, but I know that they didn't do the right things in the church, and unfortunately, I think that's something that can lead people away from churches when you have people who are running the churches making terrible decisions and treating people poorly. So,
I think that goes without saying. I mean, heck, I lost my career in high school teaching because of a kind of a jerk, who thought he was doing something for Jesus. Yeah, and I think that's what turns a lot of people off. That if that's the only Christianity you see, well, yeah, that's crap. And I think that's, but you get that with anything. I mean, nobody thinks Christians are perfect. Oh my gosh. One of my professors used to say, God has called us to love the unlovable. He's called us to be part of the church because there's a lot of unlovable jerks in the church.
Church is a hospital for sinners.
Yeah. And that's not an excuse. That's a painful admission that's the case. Yeah, I don't know. It's a. I'm sorry. Deconverted man said lame. What's his lame? What's lame? Deconverted man. There's a lot of things that are.
That's funny.
At what point can a human start to sin? Well, that's kind of the Bible doesn't try to give a starting point. It's an acknowledgement that we're human beings and we screw up and we sin. That's kind of what the point of the story is, I think.
Let me ask you another question, because it's a question that I've received a lot, and because I'm not a biblical scholar, I probably can't answer it nearly as well as you can. But how do you respond to people who chat about God of the Old Testament, and they bring up slavery, and they bring up different things that happened in Leviticus, and how do you address those?
Well, how do you address those in a minute?
I mean, just if you pick one topic, like maybe slavery. Or something.
Simply put, the ancient Near Eastern world was a pagan world. I mean, if just in the Old Testament, if you think the Israelites coming out of Egypt were like some monotheists, clearly they weren't. As soon as they get to Sinai, they're worshiping other things. They're a screwed up people living in a screwed up time. And therefore, the very fact that the claim is that God gets involved in history is that God has to start with people where they are. And so we might read some of the stuff in the Torah, the law about slaves, like, oh, they're talking about slaves. That's horrible. Well, yeah, but at the time, what the Torah rules about slavery was a lot more liberating than the general pagan stuff. And so we wouldn't have gotten to the place we are now if that first step hasn't been taken. You can't expect somebody living in a certain culture to all of a sudden just become perfectly enlightened about everything. You have to start where they are. Even with slavery, for example, you know, the fact is, in the pagan world, even in the time of Christ, slavery was just an institution that every society in the world had. I mean, it was just taken for granted. It was the Christian emphasis that there is no slave nor free, they're all one in Christ, giving honor to women and slaves, and then eventually allowing women and slaves to take part in communion because they have equal status. Eventually, it was because of the Christian influence by the time Constantine and by the 5th century that slavery in the pagan world, the institution that had always been there, was gone. It was because of that influence. It only came back in the colonial times, you know, after the Enlightenment with the, you know, of the New World, is because basically really greedy people came over to the New World and wanted to import slaves. And despite the fact that the Pope was back in Europe condemning slavery, they're like, screw that, we're in the New World, he can't touch us. And it kind of took root again. But then how did we get rid of it? It was because of Christians like William Wilberforce and the abolitionist movement. So it was the influence of Christianity that actually got rid of slavery twice. Now, granted, at that time, like pre-Civil War, yeah, because it had become part of Southern culture, a lot of people call themselves Christians and were trying to use the Bible to
justify it.
But again, when you live in a certain culture with certain prejudices, that's gonna happen. They were wrong. There was never the historical take. But it's a messy thing. That's the point.
It is, and you've offered some great viewpoints on that and good history, and so you have a lot of knowledge on a lot of this kind of stuff. What do you think is the most convincing piece of evidence for Jesus and his resurrection? Or even if I said it, do you use maybe a simple argument to talk about the empty tomb or some of the William Lane Craig kind of things? I don't really. I think one of the dangers of trying to prove it, even though I think it happened, is we tend to think that, and this is generally speaking, evangelicals do this a lot, sometimes to their detriment. They have this idea that if I can prove this happened, or if Ken Ham would say, if I can prove Genesis 1-11 is history, that'll convince people. Well, I don't think it will. People aren't going to be convinced of just proving facts, you know? With the empty tomb, you can get to basically, it's kind of a general argument, but despite what Richard Carrier says, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are historical biographies. They're ancient historical biographies. They're about a historical person. Even in the Jewish Talmud and Josephus and other people, they talk about him as a historical person. That he was a first century prophet. His group thought he was the Messiah. He was crucified. Those are just historical facts that everybody outside of Richard Carrier just realizes is true. Then, so if you have a work like Mark or Matthew or Luke that talk about a historical person and talk about historical crucifixion that pretty much everybody agrees to, and then the very next chapter says, hey, this guy rose from the dead, it's part of that work, which is a historical biography. It might be kind of it is an outlandish statement, obviously. It's not like, oh, yeah, okay. I mean, people in the ancient world, when they were told that, they didn't go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. People rise from the dead all the time. No, obviously, they thought it was a stupid claim. But they made it anyway. And so you have to ask yourself, why would they make it? What's going on? And, yeah, we can't prove it, but I think we can prove that that's what the early church claimed. The whole idea of what resurrection means is a whole other issue. Simply put, in Pharisaic Judaism, resurrection, B. I just hit a B. Resurrection meant bodily resurrection. There was no such thing as a spiritual resurrection in heaven. If Paul says resurrection, he meant bodily resurrection. So if you don't believe it, that's one thing, but that's what Paul meant. And so, when it comes to the historical facts, you can only take it so far, but ultimately, my job is to make sure people understand what Paul is actually saying and what the Gospels are actually claiming. What you do with it is your own deal. Yeah. So even in 1 Corinthians 15, when actually, Joel, when do you think some of these books were authored? I mean, do you have a sort of a timeline in your mind on when these came about?
Well, simply put, Paul's letters in the 50s and 60s, early 60s. Mark, some people think it in the 60s or early 70s, probably the earliest gospel. Matthew and Luke sometime in the 70s. John, probably in the 90s. So all of that is pretty early stuff. And again, even though, some people Bart Ehrman says, oh, that was a long time. Historically speaking, if you have documents dating from within a couple decades of the purported events, by ancient standards, that's really early. You can still assess them and critique them, but that's not a lot of time. It's, that's one of the things Bart Ehrman gets upset about is we don't actually have any documents from the time of Jesus. Well, no, his disciples weren't taking dictation while he was walking around. But when you have documents that are clearly within a generation, by historical standards, that's really early. So that's pretty dependable, So, yeah.
Do you, when you said, and one of the questions that I've been wondering is just between Matthew and Mark, and I have read that a lot of biblical scholars and people like William Lane Craig and Sean McDowell have all said that they think Mark is first, and many people say that Mark was first. I for some reason, I went back and I looked at some of the early church people who claimed that Matthew was first, and even the order in which the books are presented, Matthew's first. So I'm just wondering, what pieces of evidence seem pretty strong to people who have determined that Mark is first?
Well, it basically comes down to what they call textual criticism. Basically, Mark is shorter, when it comes to textual criticism, whenever you're looking at manuscripts, generally speaking, the shorter one is considered probably be the earlier one because it makes more sense that another writer, like say Matthew, would take Mark and add to it and elaborate on things. Then that would make more sense than Mark would take Matthew and cut things out. And so, and another thing, the way it's structured and certain things in Mark and Matthew, Mark tends to be a little more ambiguous with things. Like in the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not, let the reader understand. Well, that's kind of ambiguous. But then when you put it next to Matthew, Matthew takes that and changes it a little bit to say, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. So what you see Matthew doing, I argue, is he's taking Mark and he's making explicit certain things that Mark has implicit. Make sense? So he's elaborating, clarifying things. And that's just one example. There's a whole bunch of examples when you compare Matthew and Mark. It convinces me that Matthew probably took Mark and elaborated, clarified a number of things, and that's fine with me. So,
what's your take on Quirinius? That's another argument that I've seen presented by people like Aaron Ra. He said that because I think that they've shown that in 11 BC, Quirinius was a proconsul in Sicilia, and so I think there's some proof of that. But the whole idea of exactly when a census was taken, some people have used that as a point of contention.
I think I'd have to look it up, but in Ben Witherington has a book called New Testament History where he talks about that. And if I remember correctly, he basically says when you look at the Greek, it could be Luke is talking about this, the events, the birth happened before the census of Quirinius. Now, I think they said, was there a census in like 6 AD, basically, I think. And so Luke is acknowledging, he's not saying the event happened during the census, but it happened before the census. But again, that's a legitimate thing that scholars debate. And I don't think no matter what answer you come up with, some people aren't going to be convinced. And this is one of the things I'll probably have to wrap this up because I'm down to 8%.
Okay.
My phone. One of the things, and this is one of the things that I think Richard Carrier and Bart Ehrman get wrong just about what the Gospels are. And for that matter, when you go to the Old Testament, the Old Testament historical books, they're doing history, but they're not doing history the way we in the modern world do history. We want history to be just the facts, reporting, put it in a textbook kind of thing. The ancient world, including the Gospel writers and the writers of the Old Testament, when they're doing history, they're also doing literature. They're doing both at the same time. They're doing history in the format of a story. And therefore, when they do that, they take artistic license in how they shape the story. I liken it to Hacksaw Ridge by the Mel Gibson movie, Hacksaw Ridge. That's about a historical event, World War II, about Private Doss. So the movie is about a historical event, but in the making of the movie, Mel Gibson shapes the story. He changes things to make it for a good story. And I think that's how you have to view the Gospels and a lot of the Old Testament historical books. It's history, but it's in story format. And so you have to, when you read them, you have to keep both of them in mind. You have to be a good historian and a good literary reader. And so for one example is when Richard Carrier mentions the story of Jesus cursing the fig tree. He makes a big deal about this in one of his lectures, where he curses a fig tree, then he goes to the temple, and he trashes the temple, then he comes back and the fig tree is withered. And basically he says, well, that's stupid. That clearly didn't happen. It's all a myth. Well, and the thing that cracks me up, because he realizes that the fig tree is representative of the temple. The fig tree wasn't bearing fruit, so Jesus cursed it. Then he goes to the temple, and what we call he cleanses. He wasn't cleansing the temple. He was cursing the temple. He was calling judgment upon it. It's going to get destroyed. And so there's clearly a connection that the writer Mark is trying to make between 5% left between Mark or between the temple and the fig tree. Mark is setting that up in a literary fashion to explain the significance of Jesus' action in the temple. So, and if you can go into, you can ask the question, was there a literal fig tree that he cursed? Honestly, well, we don't know. It could be a literary device. It could have happened. But the point is, Jesus condemned, the temple. And so Carrier sees this literary technique, and he kind of concludes that since it's literary shaped, it can't be history. Well, that's how the ancient writers did their history. So anyway, if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense. And I really want to thank you, because you've shared so much information. I feel like you're just lots of knowledge on the Bible, and I hope that you'll come back again and we can chat again. Or if you create a channel, maybe we can continue this with other people and start a whole long discussion on this. You shared so much. Yeah. Did you want to say some parting things before you go? And maybe I'll also make another mention of your blog.
Okay, well, better make it quick because I have 3% left. My blog is Resurrecting Orthodoxy. It's joeledmundanderson.com. You could see that and look around. And I noticed a number of people have made questions, and obviously I haven't answered them all. If you want to get on my blog and find something and write a question I could answer, respond that way, that would be a good way to do it. And I think I'm out.
That's another. Oh, okay. Do you have barely any? Okay, so you go. Oh, there he goes.
Bye.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming on, Joel. And thank you for everyone in the audience. I see Renovation is also here. Good to see you, Renee. Great to see you, Jen with one N. I know Craig came on here and in Deconverted Man. So thank you, everybody, for showing up. And until we meet again, we'll chat soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.